Okay, hi everybody. Good evening. I'm Joan Ockman, and I have the pleasure of doing the honors tonight in Deborah's absence. So I want to welcome you all to the 29th annual Timothy Egan Lenahan Memorial Lecture, which is part of an endowed series funded by family and friends of Timothy Lenahan, Yale College class of 1980, Yale School of Architecture class of 1984, whose architectural career was cut short by his death in 1994. Previous Lenahan lectures in this series have included practitioners Michael van Valkenburg, Kate Orff, Margie Ruddick, and Walter Hood, and historians, theorists, and educators Alessandra Ponti, Charles Waldheim, Mick Young Kim, and many others. So landscape has an important place in the School of Architecture's curriculum, and the Lenahan family has generously endowed not just this lecture series, but also as memorial to Tim's mother, Lois Ulm Lenahan, a fund providing resources in support of landscape studies. The school is deeply grateful to the families for the family's continued commitment. So thank you very much. I understand Beth Lenahan is here tonight, so yeah, welcome. Okay, so this year's Lenahan lecturer is Douglas Spencer, and I'm delighted to present him to you tonight. Doug is the Director of Graduate Education and the Pickard Chilton Professor at Iowa State University's Department of Architecture. He previously taught at several schools in the UK, including the Architectural Association in London, where I had the pleasure of meeting him. And his first major book, The Architecture of Neoliberalism, How Architecture Became an Instrument of Control and Compliance, appeared from Bloomsbury in 2016 and offers a trenchant critique of contemporary architecture theory, practice, and production under the regime of late capitalism. A collection of polemical essays followed in 2020 from Bauwelt Fundamente, Birkhäuser, titled Critique of Architecture, Essays on Theory, Autonomy, and Political Economy, illustrated, by the way, with Doug's own black and white photographs. And tonight's lecture, focused on the politics of ecology, is drawn to some extent from that book, but he tells me is also something new, so we're looking forward to that. He also has a third book, Scenes of Production, Architecture, and the Subject of Capital, in the works. So the title of tonight's lecture is Design, Environment, and Renaturalization, a Critique. Thanks, Doug.
Okay, thanks very much, Joan, for that introduction, and for the invitation to come and speak to you tonight. I'll try and, it sounds like I'm really loud, so I might, if I end up getting into it and raising the volume of my voice, perhaps that could be toned down a bit. Okay, so Joan mentioned that the Critique of Architecture is a collection of polemical essays, which it is. I don't know whether it's a good or bad thing, but tonight is more polemic. My friend Charles Waldheim has taken to calling me Brother Spencer, which suggests that I'm rather preachy with what I do. I take it as affectionate. I don't know if it is. But yeah, I'm going to be making some complaints, pointing out some things, some concerns, challenging some preconceptions, but without being able to offer a neat solution at the end, so don't hold your breath for that. So where I start is that there's a broad and commonsensical supposition that in order to address ongoing conditions of climate change, we, whoever we might be, need to be closer to nature. That we need to renounce the hubris, the arrogance even, which allows us to think of ourselves, humans, as anything special or unique. This renunciation is presented not only as a necessity, given the crises of our time, especially the environmental crises of our time, but also, in some sense, as being politically progressive, even a radical move. As Ray Brassier writes in his essay, The Human, in the contemporary critical humanities, the privileging of the human has become as suspect as every other sort of privilege. Human exceptionalism is viewed as of a piece with the exclusionary logics of racism and sexism. Far from being the uncircumventable horizon for emancipatory politics, humanism is denounced as integral to the logic of domination that proceeds from the subjugation of nature to the enslavement of all those deemed less than human. End of quote. So we might see this denunciation of the human that Brassier refers to here exemplified in new materialism, for example, with its disavowal of human capacities for reasoning and critical reflection. But I think especially we see it in post-humanism. And this is where Brassier sees it especially marked. He quotes in the same essay from Rosie Braidotti as follows: appeals to the human are always discriminatory. They create structural distinctions and inequalities among different categories of humans, let alone between humans and non-humans. End of quote. And that's Rosie Braidotti from A Theoretical Framework for the Post-Humanities. The inference in this, Brassier points out, runs from exceptionalism to exclusion, that all exceptionalism necessarily leads to exclusion, that the appeal to the category of the human as such is to appeal to the category of the human as such is to practice domination. And the impulse that follows from this inference and its political implications, exclusion, oppression, inequality, is towards what Brassier terms renaturalization, hence that word's presence in the title of my lecture. A renaturalization which is itself premised on looking for what the human has in common with all nature rather than what is exceptional to it. The post-humanist current of Anglophone critical theory, he notes, proceeds from an animist metaphysics that conceives of all nature as living. So I've suggested that this proposition about being closer to nature, to renouncing our own exceptional status, is commonsensical, but it also has a register in high theory. I think it's more or less commonsensical, and certainly this is my experience as an educator. It's deeply ingrained in design practice and education as a kind of common sense understanding. I think we hear it as students in some form or another. We hear it as educators, and we hear it from educators. In a contribution to a recent collection, Jeremy Till, head of Central St Martin's in London, launches a critique against the hollow gestures of sustainability that permeate the higher stratospheres of architecture. In Architecture After Architecture, he takes aim at Grimshaw, Zaha Hadid Architects and Foster's, quite understandably, for designing airports under cover of dubious claims to carbon neutrality. In Saudi Arabia, he writes, Foster and partners raised the sustainability stakes by announcing that a new resort was going to be eco-friendly, as if for an ultra-luxury tourist destination, a car crash of environmental rights? End of quote. He then goes on to outline what, for him, is essentially wrong, as well as in bad faith, about the kind of eco-utopian projects, the floating islands and the like, that are now the staple output of so many prominent architectural practices. Too often, he writes, Jeremy Till, these speculations repeat the mistake that created the emergency in the first place, namely an unfettered command of nature splitting humans from the world they are part of. To live in the Anthropocene, he continues, the geological era in which the effects of the emergency are unfolding, needs a shift in sensibility from humans as distanced beings in the pursuit of freedom and progress to humans embedded in and responsible for a non-human world of interconnected systems. End of quote. I disagree. Not over the greenwashing of airport design for luxury tourism, but over what is essentially mistaken about speculative eco-utopian projects. The humans that Till refers to are, after all, not one. Humanity as a category is not accessible to all humans. Humanity that counts as such exists as a kind of gerrymandered district, access to which is determined by categorical distinctions between humans, most obviously according to race, class, and gender. Very few humans, in fact, ever command nature. Most are and have been subjected themselves to such commands by being classified as that being their natural place in the scheme of things. Furthermore, human beings being embedded in a world of interconnected systems is not something that we need to realise. This is already what the eco-utopian projects, like the floating islands of Bjarke Engel's Oceanics, already promise. In fact, the representation of the relations between humans and nature has, in capitalism, pretty much always been about embedding humans, most humans, within nature. So, my propositions are that environmental and green architectures typically, often posit the possibility and desirability of an unmediated relationship to nature between the human subject and the natural, where there's no boundary between them, where they have immediate access, the human has immediate access to nature as a kind of, in itself, natural condition. And this unmediated relationship implies the desirability of a continuity between the human and the natural, that there is no categorical or qualitative distinction to be made between them. And they offer up, as I'm going to show, they offer up and affirm naturalization, or rather renaturalization, because it's always seems to me a kind of redemptive project of putting things back to the natural condition that they once were and should be again. So they offer up and affirm this renaturalization, harmonization of the human with nature, in some sense, a state of non-exception, to refer back to this notion about whether we can talk about the human as exceptional or not. So a state of non-exception. The unmediated relationship to nature posited in environmental and green architecture is also individuated. This, I think, is critical, that if we look at the type of projects I'm going to touch on, if we think about the imagery that we see in what I'm calling eco-utopian or environmental design projects, it's fundamentally presented as a one-to-one relationship with a human individual and nature at large, not one that is kind of socially mediated between humans and nature. So the relationship between humans and nature is not socialized, it's not forged through any explicit recognition of this relationship as socially or collectively constructed. It's not something that involves reflection, analysis, consideration, decision-making, but something we should simply kind of just give ourselves over to. And that in giving ourselves over to, we are engaging in some restorative practice of putting things and putting ourselves back in our proper relationship to nature and the environment. I picked on Jeremy Till just because of his prominence as an educator. I could have, taken that argument from many places, but if we dig a bit deeper, I think we find something which is much more obviously disturbing, a disturbing kind of register of this argument. So if we go back to Ian McHarg in the mid-20th century, so someone who is still held very much in high esteem as a founder of environmental design. And for him, in his essay Man and Environment, he says that the problems of the city, the region, the landscape are exclusively environmental problems. And it follows then, that because they're environmental problems, they are also problems of fitness to and for environment, of what and who properly belongs to a particular environment. His notion of fitness is notably informed by biologically determinist and colonial theories of race. Get this. He says, when the primates abandoned instinct for reason, this caused a negative and destructive impact upon the environment. End of quote. Hoping to return man to a relationship of fitness to his environment, he points to the example of what he calls today's Aboriginal people, of whom he says their ecological role has changed little from that of the primate. McHarg would have us learn from the example of what he calls the simpler people who were our ancestors, like primitive peoples today, how to be at one with our environment. And just as McHarg recommends that there is an appropriate habitat for, there should be this kind of fit between peoples and habitat, he also explicitly gives this in racial dimensions, or racial terms rather. He says that Africans differ from Asians, Eskimo from Caucasoid, Mongoloid from Australoid. That, I think, kind of gets to what is, I think, probably for most people in this room, obviously problematic in what I'm saying. But I think it's also indicative of larger problems that might not be so obvious. And my rhetorical question really is, okay, so what if giving ourselves over to this renaturalization is not against the tide of capitalist development, not even mitigating its worst effects, but actually something that capitalism itself has always been invested in? What if renaturalization and its environmental apparatus is also a means to lock us into an individuated as opposed to a socialized and socially mediated relationship to nature? And I think that it is. That is precisely what capital does. It naturalizes its own modes and conditions of production, if I can use such archaic terms, and it does so through the making of environments as much as the destruction of environments, something which is, I think, kind of too easily overlooked. It's not just a camouflage, a deception, not just greenwashing, though that does go on. It's an integral component of capitalist development and as well of its infrastructural basis. We could think, for example, of the plantation as an environment, the plantation as an ecology, also the plantation as an infrastructure for capital, for the production of the key commodities in capitalism, for tea, sugar, tobacco, as produced not against the environment or against ecology, but through environmental and ecological means. So environments operate in these two registers. There's the infrastructural, the making of conditions and relations, and the making productive of these, and the representation of these at the superstructural level, the register of the cultural through naturalization and symbolic legitimation. I think that some of this can best be apprehended by addressing landscape, especially because there is this, I think there is a continuity in the aesthetics, in the methods, in the modes of landscape representation that runs from what we would classically think of as landscape painting as a particular genre, right through to contemporary representations of greened environments, of eco-utopias and the like. I'm going to start off with a contemporary example. A Dezeen article of 2018 featured a video produced by Virgin Hyperloop One and Big, Bjarke Ingels Group, purporting to demonstrate the travel experience it will present to its passengers. The high-speed transportation system's tubes, reported the piece, will feature small circular windows that work in the style of a zoetrope, a device popular in the 19th century which creates the illusion of motion. The video opens with a porthole-like aperture onto a landscape framed in black, the view offered through the Hyperloop tube with its regularly spaced windows from one of its travel pods. At the top of the screen, 3 counters register the time, speed, and distance of the journey as it unfolds over the next 3 minutes and 34 seconds. As the train sets off on its journey, the window slides out of the frame to the right, and then another reappears from the left to glide past again and again, each time more rapidly as the train accelerates. By the 30-second mark, by which point the train has reached 240 kilometers an hour, the intermittent appearance of the circular window has morphed into a strobing horizontal strip stretched across the width of the video frame. We catch glimpses of trees and green fields, telegraph poles, and isolated dwellings. At 1 minute 47 seconds, and having travelled 15 kilometres, the train reaches its full speed, perfect timing, of 1,200 kilometres an hour, at which point the frame disappears and the Hyperloop offers up an unimpeded widescreen experience of the landscape. Ostensibly produced to assuage concerns of claustrophobic travel experience, the Hyperloop video also exemplifies a more long-standing dialectical relationship between infrastructure and landscape. And this is how capital and capitalist development is tied in with naturalization. This dialectical relationship between infrastructure and landscape, in which actually each requires the other to enable its realization. To offer a more traditional example that I have written about before and in substantial part in debt here to an amazing work by John Barrell called The Dark Side of the Landscape. but this is boat building near Flatford Mill, John Constable, 1815. What we see in a painting like this is the equalisation of everything under the scopic regime of the picturesque. Everything is afforded the same treatment, all things being equal under the undiscriminating brushwork of the artist. Sky, mud, clouds, wood, figure, foliage. It's really a kind of flat ontology before its time, or a Latourian litany of things. But, as John Barrell reminds us in The Dark Side of the Landscape, the Constable family owned the land that is represented in this painting. They employed the free labour which the painting depicts, and that labour is deliberately made, according to Barrell's argument, with which I agree, that labour is made unthreatening by being isolated and depicted in the middle ground or off in the distance. There are earlier sketches of this which show, as you might imagine, that it takes more than one person to build a boat. But at the time, workers were starting to kind of organise as they came under the kind of regime of wage labour, but they become a kind of threatening, kind of spectral presence. And if we see these figures kind of at large, if we see them together in larger groups, then this disturbs the work of naturalisation that's going on in a painting like this. Here's another example that I found for comparison. It's actually slightly earlier than Constable's painting, Francis Guy. Perry Hall, slave quarters with field hands at work. This is in Maryland. I hope it's even clearer here, the argument I'm proposing that everything, by the kind of generic conventions of landscape painting, nothing is exceptional, right? But that means that everything is therefore equalized. And it doesn't really matter, it seems, whether you're looking at a tree, a cloud, or the slave or the master or the cattle. They all seem to be afforded the same equal treatment. Yeah, so we've got, again, a kind of flat ontology here that's produced by this particular regime of painting. So both paintings and the kind of equalizing, naturalizing work they are involved in are also implicated in the development of infrastructures critical to capitalism. So boat building for the canals to ship goods and fuel in the context of the Industrial Revolution and Constable's paintings, and the production of tobacco in Maryland as a key commodity in the growth of global capitalism. Things could be otherwise. Okay, so if we look at a kind of the realist approach, the realist perspective coming from France, we've got Man with a Hoe by Jean-François Millet of 1862, where the fact that, is it a landscape still, or is this a portrait? There's nothing that seems kind of pleasingly natural or picturesque about this work, and we see it as work, and we see a figure engaged in this kind of back-breaking work. But the relationship between landscape and infrastructure, we could also see it in the American urban parkway systems of the late 19th and early 20th century that Matthew Gandy has written about at great length. Designed for an affluent class of car owners, these provided for a motorized experience of the picturesque. escaping the artifice of the metropolis along the landscaped corridors of the parkway, driver and passengers were treated to a supposedly restorative contact with nature. The desire to escape the industrial metropolis into some renewed connection with nature, some restorative connection with nature as well. And it's also captured, however, with the parkway system as part of an infrastructural apparatus. Yeah, so like the appeal of the landscape and the appeal of the escape out into nature is a catalyst for capitalist growth. It's a catalyst for automobile manufacture. It's a catalyst for road building. It's a catalyst for fossil fuel extraction and suburban real estate development. So there's this ongoing dialectic of landscape and infrastructure in capitalism, the promise of an unmediated connection with nature, subtended by an infrastructural apparatus, staging its own disappearance. Yeah, that's the point in showing that hyperloop zoetrope thing. It's like it kind of is doing its job when it disappears and allows you at least the illusion of contact, unmediated contact with nature. It has to kind of undo its own mediation. So Jeremy Till talks about Norman Foster. Let's talk about Norman Foster, but in different terms. I think he really, his whole entire output exemplifies this dialectic. His oeuvre is founded, I think, on the premise that advanced building technology both sustains the environment and provides for access to nature. His kind of high-tech pastoralism is apparent in an early work like this, the Willis, Faber and Dumas headquarters in Ipswich in England of 1975. From the green carpeted rooftop restaurant, employees can look out through a seamlessly glazed, this is the important stuff, yeah? So it's like the transparency, the access, the notion of the unmediated, a seamlessly glazed curtain wall onto scenes of colleagues resting and relaxing on the rooftop garden. At a grander scale, Foster and Partners, obviously much discussed, Apple Park in Cupertino, but let's revisit it just once more, locates employees in a greened environment with, quote, over 6 kilometres of walking and jogging trails, 9,000 trees, orchards, as well as meadows, sports fields, terraces, and a secluded pond. The exterior glazing of the park's ring-shaped building provides for uninterrupted connection to the landscape. That's the words of the blurb on Foster's website. Uninterrupted connection to the landscape, the unmediated again. And its 8 atria apparently create social spaces that connect the park to the garden space within. So here, corporate cultures of well-being are serviced through the landscaping of an environment whose ultimate purpose, of course, is to increase worker productivity, which is to be channeled in turn toward the further growth of the multinational technology company. In other projects, an infrastructural architecture forms a protective enclosure for an urbanized nature. A latticed canopy shields a botanical garden at Foster and Partners Crossrail Place in London, a nature reserve offered up to passengers passing through the infrastructure of the city's rail transit system. The Kai Tak cruise terminal, designed to establish Hong Kong as the preeminent regional hub for cruise liners, features a rooftop garden providing passengers with sheltered spaces for informal picnics and outdoor dining. A lecture given by Foster in 2018 is, I think, especially revealing of his conception, a kind of career-long conception of the relationships between landscape and infrastructure. Musing on the possibilities for a sustainable future for the planet, Foster imagines the countryside transforms so that what he calls the dreams of Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City can at last become a reality. Likewise, Ebenezer Howard's vision of the Garden City, he says, suddenly seems radically new, not least, of course, since his own Apple Park so strongly resembles Howard's formal diagram of a ruralised urbanism. Foster looks forward to a future where the infrastructure becomes invisible, autonomous, so that we might go to have a picnic in Battersea Park and the picnic table disappears in the ground beneath us and we pop up in San Francisco because of Hyperloop. End of quote. So as hard infrastructures disappear, the city in this vision becomes one great, greened and globally interconnected environment. Smart technologies will connect entire cities, changing how we live and work. Physical infrastructure will become obsolete, intones the voiceover from an accompanying video segment of this lecture while we watch a drone fly over a favela. The becoming invisible of infrastructure services consumption. Industries of travel, shopping, and leisure, an on-demand provision for individual needs and wants, the satisfaction of which is supposed to reconnect us with nature and to resolve for us in the process the environmental crisis. So the free market to the rescue, the redemption of the unfulfilled promise of Foster's forebears, Ebenezer Howard, Frank Lloyd Wright, Buckminster Fuller. The visions of the future promulgated by the billionaire class, by those personifying capital in its most hyper-concentrated form. There's a rogues gallery if ever you wanted to see one. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson also, of course, share in Foster's retro-futurist and redemptive framing of the environmental question. Infrastructures of space travel, expanding the reach of capital out into the cosmos will, it's argued, save the planet, allowing Earth to be salvaged as a safe haven for nature, while space is transformed into some kind of galactic reservoir of resource extraction. As the mission statement of Bezos's Blue Origin company states, Blue Origin was founded by Jeff Bezos with the vision of enabling a future where millions of people are living and working in space to benefit Earth. In order to preserve Earth, Blue Origin believes that humanity will need to expand, explore, find new energy and material resources and move industries that stress Earth into space. And we might well ask, who is going to be doing this work in space, and will they have a union or not? Bezos, in a presentation of 2019, imaginatively titled Going to Space to Benefit Earth, deployed 4 images. These, again, I think have been quite well discussed in a number of places, but here's my take on them. So he deploys these 4 images to illustrate his vision for extraplanetary environments. One depicts Renaissance Florence in its foreign middle ground, extending into a kind of alpine landscape, its skies dissolving at its outer edges to reveal the cylindrical frame of the spacecraft in which it is housed. Another presents an agricultural landscape, recalling Grant Wood's depictions of Home Sweet Home for me, rural Iowa, traversed by a train speeding along an elevated rail line out of some more densely populated urban condition off in the distance. A third assumes a more sublime aesthetic. A lone stag stands on a rocky ledge, waterfalls cascade into the valley and mists cleave to the mountainsides. The 4th image is equally theme park worthy, a future world or Tomorrowland of greened urbanism and foliage-covered skyscrapers. Now, Fred Sharman has argued that Bezos's vision and its accompanying images do little more than rehash a presentation of the future of space travel that was originally given to Congress in 1975 by the physicist Gerard O'Neill. And Sharman argues that all Bezos has to offer, really, what's revealed here, is a watered-down version of nostalgia for yesterday's future. And he's thinking of these images by Don Davis and Rick Giudice. So Bezos's proposal, he writes, is a version of O'Neill's project that somehow manages to look and feel less futuristic than its predecessor. But it might also be added that this is not just like a kind of individual failing if we take seriously the notion that individuals in capitalism only personify capital. Then we might understand that this is a kind of systemic issue rather than the individual failing of Jeff Bezos or whoever he has doing his renderings. It might be argued that a nostalgia for the future is all that the billionaire ruling class and their retinue of Imagineers are capable now of dredging up from their near exhausted repertoire. And even what Sharman refers to here as yesterday's future already traded in a landscape imagery standing not so much even at the time for the future, but for a reduction of the future to a natural phenomenon rooted in specifically Western notions of nature. The O'Neill cylinder, as depicted by Rick Giudice and Don Davis, was already a means to convey an essentially 18th century aesthetic of the picturesque into outer space. Landscape still carrying out its work of naturalization so that capitalism could continue to persuade us of its viability, consolidating and protecting its legacy. Infrastructure operates in these depictions much as it does in those of Foster, as the vehicle for this cultural payload. The visions of O'Neill and Bezos alike depict landscape as both subject and object of capital's unending expansion. So I just wanted to kind of go back to those images and just to make this point about the kind of continuity of the landscape idea. This is actually a painting by Thomas Cole. I had to go back and forward, well, kind of forward to this one. So there's a clip that's from Tomorrowland, but then the one at the top, perhaps it's a bit of a stretch, but it reminded me of this kind of husk ruin form of the Swiss reinsurance building, reminding me of the portrayal of the Bank of England as a ruin overcome, kind of returned to nature. More familiar images, I know. But earthbound iterations of future landscapes extend this same proposition, offering up scenarios in which individuals are at liberty to freely enjoy and directly experience nature. Figures tilling the soil on the floating islands of Biggs Oceanics, or kayaking in the same environment, the kind of ubiquitous kayak of the eco-utopia. For the migrant farm workers dying of heat stroke as global temperatures rise, or those forced by floods to take to a makeshift raft, the problem is not one of being alienated from nature as such, but of being too much exposed to its forces, especially under the historically specific conditions of climate change wrought by capitalist development. To address this systemic issue, and this is the provocation, is beyond the scope of design alone. And that refers back to this notion of the, what would a socially mediated relationship be, and one that could be acknowledged. How would that look different? And I don't think design alone and by itself can effectively address that. So to address this systemic issue is, I'm saying, beyond the scope of design alone. Under its own initiatives, it can offer up, at best, punctual interventions, localized and stopgap solutions to a situation that requires, at a minimum, that infrastructures function as collective instruments of care and maintenance for human and other than human natures, rather than as discrete apparatuses of growth, accumulation, and consumer services. At its worst, design offers up narratives. Better futures plucked from its own self-esteemed imagination, like Tafuri's half-century-old critique of formal utopias never happened or no longer applies. We need to think again and to think better about human exceptionalism and its implications. Human exceptionalism need not mean or result in exclusion. It could also be an argument for inclusion when we think of the human beyond its dominant representation, when we think of the human as something that could be expanded as a radically inclusive categorization. I think that Sylvia Wynter's critique of the human as being overrepresented by the white Western colonizing man, a figure that has colonized the very category of the human, is just this sort of project. A project, as she says, to unsettle the coloniality of being, but that's not the same as unsettling the concept of the human as such. The post-humanist perspective and its commonsensical expressions in architecture and design urge that we overcome or transcend the category of the human. To return to Brassier's remarks, however, an emancipatory politics would lie surely in realizing the full potential of the human, which capital works against by means of individuation and naturalization. For Marx, the human, and he's especially explicit about this in his earlier works, the so-called early or young Marx, for Marx, the human was indeed exceptional, possessed of a distinctive species being, where it is not, what is distinctive is precisely that it is not and cannot be immediately at one with its worlds, where its needs and wants cannot be immediately satisfied in nature, but have necessarily to be socially mediated through language, through the making of social relationships, through the social construction of its relationship to nature. The species being of the human is one where it has to operate as a species and not as an individual, and where it cannot operate by instinct alone, contra McHarg. In capitalism, however, we are largely denied access to this capacity. This is the result. Like posthumanism, capitalism wants us to get over ourselves and accept our given and proper place in the natural order of things. For design to play a meaningful part in challenging this state of affairs and its consequences, this would mean shifting from its long-standing practice of naturalizing the social to working with and for the socialization of nature. Thank you.